Picture an almost surreal scene. At the end of the 19th century, if you were a man of extraordinary wealth, seeking the most extravagant experience the world had to offer, where would you go? London? Paris? New York? None of the above. You would travel to the deepest reaches of the Amazon rainforest, to a city called Manaus. At the time, Manaus was the most flamboyant boomtown on Earth. Its wealthy elite did not drink champagne from glasses, they poured it into horse troughs. When their clothes got dirty, they did not bother with local laundries. Instead, they loaded their garments onto ships, sent them halfway around the globe to Paris for dry cleaning, and had them shipped back again. They even built, in the middle of a jungle teeming with mosquitoes and caimans, a grand opera house to rival anything in Europe, the Teatro Amazonas, with bricks and stained glass, imported from Italy. What fueled such reckless extravagance? They held in their hands the most coveted, most scarce substance the modern world craved. Liquid gold. Natural rubber. With the eruption of the Second Industrial Revolution, the demand for rubber became insatiable. Telegraph lines needed rubber insulation. Factory machines needed rubber belts. And most critically of all, the automobile and the bicycle had been invented. The entire world was scrambling for rubber to make tires. But nature had played a cruel trick. The remarkable tree that bled white latex, Hevea brasiliensis, the para rubber tree, grew wild in one place. And one place only. The Amazon rainforest. The Brazilian government held a total monopoly over the global rubber supply. They sat atop a mountain of gold and laid down an iron law. Not a single rubber seed was to leave Brazilian soil. Anyone caught trying would be shot on sight. They believed that as long as they controlled this jungle, Brazil would hold the world by the throat. Forever. Then, a destitute English adventurer slipped quietly into the forest, carrying nothing but a few battered wooden crates. Before the heist itself, it is worth understanding how Brazil actually produced its rubber, and why it cost more than gold. The process was, in essence, a primitive game of Russian roulette. Rubber trees in the Amazon do not grow in neat clusters. They are wildly dispersed, sometimes kilometers apart. The rubber barons hired, or more accurately, enslaved vast numbers of indigenous people. These workers, known as seringueiros, or rubber tappers, would set out before dawn into a jungle crawling with venomous snakes, jaguars, and malaria. They would score a cut into the bark of each tree and collect the small cup of white sap that trickled out. This was not agriculture. This was a harvesting trade paid for in human lives. By some estimates, every ton of Amazon rubber produced claimed one life. It became known as blood rubber. This inefficient, brutal, and deeply unstable method of production was driving the British Empire to distraction. Britain was at the peak of its industrial power, and if Brazil could choke off the rubber supply, the empire's machinery would grind to a halt. The director of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew issued the highest order. At whatever cost, Brazilian rubber seeds must be smuggled out and cultivated in British colonial territories. It was a near impossible task. Rubber seeds are extraordinarily fragile. Rich in oil, once they fall from their pods and are exposed to the air, they rot and lose viability within days. And that is before factoring in the weeks-long sea voyage across the equatorial heat back to England. Numerous botanists had tried. Some died in the jungle. Others returned with nothing but foul-smelling pulp. Then, in 1876, an Englishman named Henry Wickham stepped forward. Wickham was no government agent. He was a down-on-his-luck English fortune seeker who had been scraping by in South America for years. But he had a nose for opportunity. When a secret commission from the British government reached him, he made a breathtakingly audacious decision. If he was going to steal, he would steal big. A few hundred seeds would be pointless. He would take 70,000. Wickham ventured deep into the finest rubber groves of the Amazon basin. During the narrow window when the seeds were ripe, he hired local indigenous workers and amassed a staggering 70,000 plump, viable rubber seeds. To prevent them from rotting, he wrapped them carefully in banana leaves and rattan and stored them in open, ventilated baskets. But the deadliest problem remained: how to get them out? Brazilian customs was ruthlessly vigilant. Never mind 70,000 seeds. 7 would be enough to get a man killed. Then fortune smiled on the British. A large English steamship called the Amazonas was sitting idle in port, unable to secure enough cargo for its return voyage. Wickham marched straight aboard and, invoking the authority of the British government, chartered the entire vessel. As the ship laden with seeds glided into the Brazilian customs checkpoint at the port of Belém, Wickham delivered the performance of his life. Facing the boarding officials, Wickham maintained perfect composure. He gestured towards the carefully packed baskets and declared, "Officers, I must ask you to exercise the utmost caution. These contain exceedingly rare botanical specimens destined for Her Majesty Queen Victoria herself. Should they be disturbed or damaged in the heat of this hold, you will be facing a most serious diplomatic protest from the British Empire." It was a masterclass in borrowed authority, and it worked. In that era, no minor customs official dared provoke the Queen of the British Empire. The officers, knowing nothing of botany and reassured by Wickham's impeccable English bearing, waved the shipment through without so much as lifting a lid. And so, the vessel carrying Brazil's future. A century of national fortune, packed into woven baskets, steamed out into the Atlantic. With a long blast of its whistle.
Accelerated under the lantern light.
When Wickham arrived at the Royal Botanic Gardens with his cargo, the botanists worked through the night. Of the 70,000 seeds, the long voyage had taken its toll. Only around 2,700 germinated successfully. But for the British Empire, those 2,700 seedlings were worth more than 2,700 tons of gold. Because the British had no intention of harvesting rubber the way the Brazilians did scavenging in the wild, at the mercy of nature. What the British intended was the weapon at which industrial civilization excelled above all else: intensive, large-scale cultivation. The precious seedlings were placed in specially built climate-controlled cases and shipped to Britain's Asian colonies, Ceylon, Malaya, and Singapore. In Southeast Asia, the British demonstrated what a true paradigm shift looked like. They cleared the scrubland and planted rubber trees in neat, uniform rows across open plains as methodically as planting corn. In Brazil, a worker might walk an entire day to tap a few dozen trees. On a Malayan rubber estate, the trees stood just meters apart. A single worker could tap several hundred in a day. No venomous snakes. No jaguars. Nothing but pure, relentless efficiency. More devastating still, British botanists subjected the rubber tree to aggressive selective breeding and grafting, multiplying its latex yield many times over. Through the fusion of science, capital, and industrial management, a wild plant, once scattered across the jungle floor, was transformed into a high-output latex-producing machine. Southeast Asian rubber plantations took roughly a dozen years to mature. During those years, Brazil continued its revelry, oblivious to the approaching catastrophe. By the early 20th century, plantation rubber from Southeast Asia began flooding the international market. The outcome was inevitable. Southeast Asian rubber cost less than a third of what wild Amazonian rubber did, and its quality was remarkably consistent, free of impurities. The global market turned overnight. In 1910, Brazil still controlled nearly half of the world's rubber market. Barely a decade and a half later, by 1930, its share had collapsed to a mere 1%. The British had not only achieved self-sufficiency, they had seized total dominance of the global market. Brazil's rubber economy suffered a catastrophic, avalanche-like collapse. Prices fell below the cost of extraction. The tappers who had risked their lives in the jungle could no longer afford to eat and fled in droves. The rubber barons, once as wealthy as nations, were ruined overnight, leaving behind nothing but worthless mansions. The once mighty city of Manaus, severed from its lifeblood of capital, could not even keep its generators running. The lights of the opera house went dark. The orchestra disbanded. The streets were swallowed again by mud and water. Nature reclaimed the land with cold indifference. The glamour faded, and Manaus returned to what it had been. A crumbling outpost, lost deep in the jungle. What Wickham stole was not 70,000 seeds. He stole an entire century of Brazil's national fortune. For this epic act of botanical theft, Henry Wickham was knighted by the British Crown. In Britain, he is celebrated as a hero. In Brazil, to this day, his name remains synonymous with thief and pirate. But if we step outside the frame of morality and view this through the lens of commercial history, it is a profoundly instructive parable. Did Brazil fall simply because its seeds were stolen? No. Brazil fell because of supreme arrogance and complacency. It sat on a treasure found nowhere else on Earth, yet never once thought to study it scientifically, to improve it, to scale it. It merely extracted from nature by brute force and mistook monopoly for an eternal fortress. Britain's victory was built on systems, science, and capital, a complete reinvention of the entire supply chain. The lesson is stark. No supremacy built on the mere monopoly of a natural resource is unassailable. When complacent inefficiency meets ruthless industrial efficiency, the reckoning comes swiftly and without mercy. This is the story of the Great Rubber Heist. Was Wickham a champion of civilization? Or a shameless biopirate? If Brazil had pursued intensive cultivation on its own, could the British Empire ever have stolen that dominance? If you enjoy this kind of gripping, deep dive breakdown of business history, do not forget to like, subscribe, and share.